Thank you for joining me for another study in church history. Like I said in our introduction, I'm not a church history buff, so to speak. I'm certainly not an expert, but there are certain things and people and places and events about church history that I think will be interesting and maybe fun for us to review. So when I thought about looking at church history, I decided that in the next two lessons that we would do what I said in the first one, which is the first church history book ever written is the book of Acts. If you were to turn to the book of Acts and you were to read it, what you would find is that Luke wrote an account to the same man Theophilus that he had written the Gospel of Luke to, a man who was a lover of God and a lover of the church. And in the book of Acts, then, the Luke himself wrote about the apostles, Apostle Peter and James and John, and then eventually he talks to us about Paul and Barnabas and Silas and takes us from the beginning of the church all the way through Paul's arrest in the city of Rome. Now, what I want you to think about this morning is at the beginning of the church history reflects a number of things. One of the things it reflects is the same thing that the church has faced every century, and that is persecution. In the early chapters of the book of Acts, we read about persecution, both from the Jewish religious leaders, from the Roman government leaders. I mean, we see the persecution ramping up more and more until we come to Acts chapter 7 and we find the first martyr of the church. His name is Stephen. And Stephen, in his last words, as it were, in chapter 7, he gives us a whole flow of the history of Israel, and he calls people to faith. Well, he was the first martyr ever to die on behalf of the church. And then later in Acts chapter 12, we find the first of the apostles that were ever martyred, and that was the man named James. You will recall that his brother was John, and with Andrew and Peter and James and John, they were the first of the four disciples, later to be called apostles, that Jesus called. Herod thought he did everybody a big favor by killing James, only to find out that it didn't go so well for Herod. And then later in the book, we find that God set aside two men, Barnabas and Saul, who would soon be called Paul, and actually who would soon take the precedence over Barnabas and Saul to become Paul and Barnabas. And they were the first to take the gospel to the world. They began to travel all over the ancient Roman world. The book of Acts, records 3 trips that they took. And in those trips, the gospel spread throughout the Roman Empire. And so in the book of Acts, we have the first martyr of the church, the first of the apostles who died, and the first of the worldwide expansion of the church in the missionary journeys of Paul, Barnabas, Silas, and his team. I think that what we learn from that in church history is God isn't yet done building his church, and persecution will come, and it is still our call to take the gospel around the world. The next study, we're going to look at another character from the Bible to end the first century of the time of the church. Thank you for joining me.